Hello everyone, and this is going to be a video that a couple people have asked for. A few YouTubers out there and a couple of my friends on Facebook have asked if I had any thoughts on the lowering of oil prices, if I had any idea like what the cause could be. And because people know that I work in that industry. So I'm going to say first that obviously the price of a good is based on supply and demand. And I think that when you're talking about something that is used by so many people in so many different places, the number of, I mean, still you say simply supply and demand, but the number of variables pertaining to each is astronomically huge. The number of consumers, the number of industries, the number of countries that both produce it and consume it is a lot, and anything is going to affect the price. Whatever, a crop failure or a drought in one place, an oil fire in another, a war one place, regulations in another place, a new regime someplace else. All these things have a cumulative effect, and so I think bearing that in mind, I think a one answer is kind of always wrong. I mean, there's always thousands or millions, if not more, factors that are going into it. And so to say, well, it's because of a new tax. Well, but that's a new tax, but in the context of everything else that's happening. Um, Now, a lot of people have asked if this has to do with fracking, and I'd have to say, well, of course, obviously, and I guess to refine my comments, well, that's true that like everything that could affect the price has an effect on the price. There are certain things that maybe have more of an effect that have done more or less. So if we have something like what happened with OPEC, like an oil embargo or a major war in the Middle East, or something else that really disrupts the supply, that might explain a bigger than normal decrease or increase in a way that just looking at the aggregate of everything else might not. Um, so from my perspective, I don't know enough about all the things that go into demand, right? So a lot of times when I've read about this, and I don't read about it all the time, but people will say things like, well, demand in China, if there's an economic collapse in China, which apparently there has been, their industrial demand will sink, and that will, of course, make prices go up, or in Japan or in Europe. And those are all factors, and I don't know how much they are. I don't know how much, you know, East Asian demand is affecting the price in the United States and how much it doesn't affect the price in the United States. But what I can say is that on a fundamental level, the United States is producing more than they have in the past, more than any other time in the past, and that fracking is a big part of the reason for this. Now, there are more than one reason for this. When I was doing work in Utah, which some of you may remember a couple years ago, um, that was an area that was not getting fracked. There was no fracking going on in Utah, or at least the area that I was working in. And it was it was a very old field. It was a field that had been drilled extensively since at least the 30s, if not before. Basically, when you drive around there, everywhere was like a patchwork of former drilling rig pads, and condensate tanks, and the infrastructure to extract hydrocarbons from that area was old and was everywhere. There were pumper jacks everywhere. And when I started working there in 2011, they had two oil rigs. There was basically one oil company that basically owned most of the oil rights in this particular area, most of the property. There were many other oil companies, but in this entire valley, and it was a large area, was this one company, and they had two oil rigs that they were going. And having talked to the geologist a lot, and that was my job, basically, was to communicate with the geologist all the time and to look at the on-site geology on each location that we were at. Just to go into a little bit about my job, basically I create stratigraphic underground maps of each oil well when they're being created. They drill a well, I'll take rock samples, I'll take a whole bunch of readings about how much gas there is, how much oil, how fast they drill, how hard the rock is, various chemical tests, and I'll create a chart of that, a map, so to speak, and that will be, I'll then give that to the oil company every day, and talk to them about where we are, where we're supposed to be, and having talked to the geologists out there, they were saying things like, this was a huge field. If you go back into the like 70s and 80s, there would have been many, many rigs here, and it's slowly been tapped out. There's slowly less and less, and the number of rigs, they said if you'd been here 10 years ago, there would have been a dozen rigs. If you'd been here 5 years ago, there would have been, half a dozen rigs. Now there's only two. In a year, we'll probably go down to just one, and then a year after that, that'll probably be it. They're basically looking for the leftovers, the little tiny bits of patches of oil, and this is what they were primarily producing out here, was oil and paraffin. We're looking, well, they weren't trying to get paraffin, but they were producing a lot of it, and just getting the last little bits of this. And this is an area that had just been poked through, hundreds or thousands of times, you know, and that we were basically told this is going to last about a year, and we'll be done. And then about a year into it, they developed a new type of, I just want to say, radar, something that could look into the ground and detect where the petroleum was. And when they looked, there was still a lot. There was a lot that they had never seen, that they hadn't been able to detect previously. And so instead of going from 2 rigs to one and then to zero, they brought in a second rig, and then a third, and then a fourth, and a fifth. And basically they said there was oil almost everywhere here. And then production in that area increased, like considerably. And that obviously is going to, I mean, this is a relatively small scale. We're talking about this one particular region in eastern Utah, and yet that's an increase. But that is not from fracking. That wasn't from fracking technology making, new oil available. That was just from new technology increasing the amount of reserves that they thought that there were. Um, Now, fracking's been around a long time. I don't know all the details, but in the early 2000s in Texas, the technology was made better and made economical and cost effective to produce from a certain type of rock called dark shale or black shales. These are shales that are very hard, they're not very porous, and most hydrocarbons are produced from rock that is porous, that is almost like a sponge. That kind of a good way to think about it would be like, say, you have 2 books, and I have more than 2 books, but so let's say we have 2 layers of rock here. Well, let's say the machinery freedom is the oil rock, and then making economic sense is the bedrock underneath, and Rampal is the rock on top. And let's say that machinery freedom uh, is oil bearing. It was used to be at the bottom of an ocean, and it had a lot of coral reefs and a lot of organic material or whatever else, and it's been under the right conditions. And then this layer on top of it, this hard Rampal layer, this prevented those hydrocarbons from seeping to the surface. So what typically happens is hydrocarbons, since they're lighter than rock, will seep to the surface. They'll leach into the topsoil, and they'll eventually be eaten up by bacteria and be gone. And like 99% of all the oil that's ever existed happened to it long before humans were extracting it. And if you've ever heard of the oil sands, that's exactly what those are. Those are oil formations that form deeper, percolated to the surface, and are in the process of being desiccated by bacteria, but we've found a way to extract from them. So anyway, this is cap rock, which keeps the oil underground. But this layer, this machinery freedom, this oil bearing area, um, is basically like a sponge. Now, if you hold it, it's not soft, but it's porous enough that under pressure it will hold hydrocarbons. So oil company comes and drills a hole through this book. And if you imagine if these were 2 solid books and this was actually a wet sponge and I squeezed it, nothing would happen. But as soon as I poke a hole in the top, what would happen? All the water would squirt out the top, and that's essentially what happens with an oil rig, right? Put these books back. I knew I had them all for a reason. Well, oil shells, or not oil shells, dark shales are not porous rocks. So basically, if that mid layer was a dark shale and you drill through it, even though there were hydrocarbons, really none would leach out except for in the actual hole, the bore that you drilled. Well, that's not a lot of oil. You can't drill, and if you only get what's in the bore from where the drill bit has actually gone, that's not going to be very much. You want to get from all the surrounding strata. Well, what fracking has done is made it possible to basically shatter all of that surrounding rock so that it will flow in. And how they do it exactly, I don't know. They use high pressure, they use a lot of chemicals. Um, it sounds to me like they that they would be using some kind of explosions, but I actually don't think that's the case. But conceptually, that's what's happening. Um, and when this technology was developed, basically the proven reserves of the United States increased dramatically. Um, Most of the work that I've done was not in Utah, but it was in the Appalachian Basin, especially in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio. And there is a formation there that some of you may have heard about because it's been in the news a lot, not recently, but in the last maybe 10 years, and that's called the Marcellus Shale. So Marcellus Shale is a black shale. It looks very similar to, say, a black chalkboard. And they knew that there were hydrocarbons there all along, even 20, 30 years ago, there, probably even before, that was a formation that had hydrocarbons in it. Because the rock was not porous, it was basically unrecoverable. These may have well have been oil reserves on Mars or the moon. There was no economical way to retrieve them. And so, when they drilled in those areas previously, which they had, I mean, the oil industry started in Ohio, in Pennsylvania. That is another area that's been used to produce hydrocarbons for a long time. They weren't producing them from this formation. They were producing them from other formations, typically ones that were more shallow, that were more recent, areas of hydrocarbon production. And this isn't, there's nothing there that we can use. It's just, yes, there is some gas there, there's natural gas there and whatnot, but it's not in a form that we don't have a means of extracting it. So as far as I know, they weren't even counted in the reserves of the United States. They were just there. Well, this technology was developed in Texas at a different black shale, a dark shale area called the Eagleford shale, the one that I've never worked at, but we've all heard about it. And once that technology was developed, all of a sudden, all of these areas with other dark shale formations became producible areas. And the numbers of areas that are like that is huge. Okay, so the Marcellus Shale, if you can go and Google it and look on a map, and this isn't to say every part of it is producible, but I think most of it is. It's a huge area. It basically runs down the entire spine of the Appalachians. So you go all the way up to Lake Erie, and upstate New York, and who knows, maybe even as far as New Hampshire, all through Pennsylvania, down through West Virginia, Western Virginia, Maryland, um, you know, down into Kentucky and Tennessee, and even into like North Georgia. It's a huge area. And not only that, that's not the only dark shale formation that's there. There are other strata within that. I mean, many of the wells that I did in that area weren't Marcellus wells. They were other dark shale wells that are just 1,000 feet above or below the Marcellus that also produce hydrocarbons, you know. And then you have the Eagleford, which is in Texas, which I think produces more than the Marcellus does. And then the biggest one so far is actually in North Dakota. North Dakota um, went ahead and leaped ahead of all other states in hydrocarbon production because of their formation, which is called the Bakken Shale. And everything I've heard there is that I've never worked there. I've almost been sent to North Dakota several times over my career. Thankfully, never have. Everything I've heard is it's pretty wildcat there. If you watch that video I did on John Oliver, I talk about that a little bit there. But that field is even bigger, and there are many, many others, many lesser fields. There's probably fields in Alaska that even with the fracking, they don't even bother going. Just like there's a huge amount of coal in Alaska that they don't even bother mining, just because it's so expensive to work up there. But the resources are sitting there. It's just a question of the economics of making them recoverable. So basically my entire career, I mean, I did some work in Utah, I've done some work in Texas, I've done work here and there, and in Oklahoma and Utah and a few other places. I'd say 85% of the work in my career, though, has been in these dark shale formations, especially in Appalachia. They've been in areas that 15 or 20 years ago they weren't producing out of, and now they're producing everywhere. When I was working in West Virginia, we were literally carpeting every bit of that country, like as a grid. I mean, they would go down and just grid out the entire substrata everywhere they could. The only place, there were places they couldn't reach because they were in a town or whatever. That was the only thing. Otherwise, we were going everywhere. I would go up and I would go to the head of a valley, and they'd put an oil rig there, and they'd drill 5 or 6 wells from that one spot, and then they'd have them go out, and then they'd all fan out and create like this huge swath, Each well would be maybe like, I don't know, maybe 1,000, 2,000 feet apart. I mean, they start at the surface, they'd be right together, but they can actually change the direction of where the hole goes. A lot of people don't realize this, but they can do directional drilling and actually, instead of just going straight down, they can go down and they can curve, right? So if we bring back, this, and in reality, there would be many more layers than this, but instead of just going straight through like that, they can come down at an angle. And once they get into the part that produces oil, instead of just going straight through it and only getting that much, they can go in and go horizontal through it for a mile, 2 miles. And so you get, instead of 200 feet of producible zone, you get 2 miles of producible zone. And I basically spent most of my career looking at the exact same rocks as we went through these horizontal sections of these wells. And they were literally coating the entire area with well after well after well. We'd go in one spot and we would make all, 4 or 5 wells that would create just a giant swath, and then come down like 1 mile down the valley, build another one, another, set up another site, and then they do the same thing there, and just on and on and on, and like literally like covering the entire topography of the state everywhere, because these formations are everywhere. These dark shale formations, they don't exist like in a pocket here and a pocket here and a pocket here. They're pretty much everywhere. All right, this is basically an area that was the bottom of the ocean. I think the Marcellus is a mid-Devonian deposition, although it's been a while, not 100% sure. But this was all at the bottom of some sea, and it'd be like trying to systematically, you know, uh, mine the entire bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. It's just a huge, enormous area. And the other shales are no different than that. And so the proven reserves of the United States just kind of went through the roof, and these companies jumped on it. They started producing more and more. And each one of these wells, they drill a well, and like when they're drilling the second well, that first well is just shooting out fucking hydrocarbons, and then the next well will shoot out, even more. Now, what I've heard is that a lot of these fracking wells, they tend to not have, they have a pretty big decrease in how much they produce per year. Usually when you start a well at the beginning, it will produce a lot, and then it will gradually reduce. And usually it's a fairly big reduction, especially in the first couple of years. Now, some wells last for decades and even over 100 years. And I've heard stories of there are places in Ohio and Pennsylvania where you have like wooden construction, oil retaining stuff that was built 1910 or whatever, that's still maybe those probably aren't producing a ton. They might only produce a couple barrels, maybe 1 barrel a day, 2 barrels a day, 50 barrels a week, whatever it is. Um, and I don't know what the rates of these um, fracked dark shale wells are. Like I work on them when they're being drilled. They don't give me the numbers of how much they're producing after. I know they have a lot of gas in them. I mean, when they drill, my primary task is, one of them is to actually monitor how much hydrocarbons is coming out, and it's a lot. I mean, it's almost like pure natural gas coming out of the ground some of the times. It's been 7, 8 days, and every day they're drilling all day long, and they're constantly just nothing but gas coming out. There could be a huge flare the entire time, and just imagine how much energy that is. And that's just from a well bore that might be this big. Like the diameter of the drill bit might be 6 inches when they do the middle section, and that's producing like a 30-foot flare. And you just imagine that's just from 6 inches, but they're going to frack. They could be drawing from an area, considerably more than that. I don't know how much, but it could be potentially hundreds or thousands of feet even, which is just crazy. So like, I mean, I've done hundreds of wells almost, probably. I don't keep track anymore. I lost track. There are so many, and that's just me. Like there's plenty of other people who've done hundreds, thousands of new wells have been drilled in the United States, probably. Um, I'm sure it's a few thousand. I don't know exactly how many, but like, and all those wells are just pumping out all this supply. And like, the population in the United States is not going up faster than the production of these hydrocarbons. The demand, whether it's going up or down, it's not going to go up that fast. And so that's definitely a big factor. Now, the other thing a lot of people kind of wonder about, like, is this like the government and blah blah blah, and there's a lot of conspiracy, like, oh, we're doing this to like hurt Russia or whatever. um I tend to, I mean, obviously government is one of those factors that can affect price, but usually kind of indirectly and kind of, uh, they can, I mean, if they declare war on the Middle East or whatever, that can affect the price. Obviously, if they add a tax, that can, affect the price. If they remove a tax, that can affect the price. I think in general, all the regulations they have on who can drill and what other types of energy are available affects the price. So, like, becoming a power producing utility or company is very difficult to do legally. And so, that's keeping the prices up. Even if you wanted to not do oil, if you wanted to do a nuclear power plant or a hydroelectric plant or a solar power plant or whatever else, um, you would be prevented. And the fact that you're prevented raises the cost on the price on everything else. Even things that you're not directly competing with. Even if you weren't becoming an oil company, the fact that you can't open up your own nuclear power plant or your own solar power plant or your own wind farm that would export, that's going to raise the price too. So government has an effect in that sense. I don't think. I mean, I just don't see the level of intricate control of the Obama and the Bush administration going out and telling the oil companies go and drill more wells so that we can lower the price so that we can hurt Russia. I don't see that as what's happening. I think these oil companies, all of a sudden there were new fields, there are new areas that they could expand, there was new profits to be made, and they just went after them. I don't think you need a better explanation than that. The regulatory agencies of the government are very slow. These big booms happen in these states that have histories. I mean, West Virginia's had oil production in it for a long time, but their regulatory agency doesn't really change when all of a sudden the number of wells that are getting drilled there increases a lot. Um, and this is especially from what I've read, especially true in a place like North Dakota. But these are just regulatory agencies. They're not dictating to the companies drill more, drill less. The only thing they really can dictate is to drill less. That's only real effect is negative. I mean, if it were to have a positive effect, that would only be to undo a previous negative effect, right? So, like a tax. If they lay a tax on, that's going to raise the price. If they take the tax off, the price goes up. You're like, oh yeah, government made the price go down. No, it made the price go up and then it made it go back down. Assuming that it's ever done that, which is unlikely. Now listening to Obama talk, but they're not. They don't. They don't. We don't have nationalized industry, right? So they can't go. It's not like a Citgo or some of these other Middle Eastern or Russian government owns the means of production and the government has nationalized the oil industry. That's not the case here. Obviously, it's a mixed economy and there's rent seeking and all that. But the government doesn't control the oil rigs and go and say, hey, drill more wells because we want it for geopolitical reasons. Maybe they're happy about it. Maybe they're smiling about it. Who knows? This is, I think, but it's a fairly profound geopolitical thing in the sense that like the United States is now exporting oil. I don't know if we still actually produce more than we consume, but some of it's getting exported now. They're building tankers in Texas to start shipping the stuff out of here. Um, as it is right now, because of the low prices, the amount of activity is shifting downward. So like if 2 years ago these oil companies were looking at their balance sheets and going, okay, well next year we want to drill 150 new wells in a certain area, the prices come down by half, they might be saying, let's maybe drill 3 wells. And the that area in Utah I referenced earlier that wasn't doing the fracking, they weren't doing that. They were just it's traditional field. They were expanding until last year, and then they just said, that's it. At these prices, we can't afford to go and drill more wells in this area. And they racked up. They took their rigs and they just said, go find something else to drill, not here though, and they just stopped. Now that oil company still owns that area. They're still producing oil out of the wells they already have, and when prices come up, should they ever do so, they'll probably start drilling there again. I'm assuming they know exactly where to start to keep going. But again, that's yeah, and I mean, there's been a huge decrease in the amount of activity that's going on. Everybody, and this is a cyclical thing. This happens in the oil industry a lot. When I started working in the industry in 2008, that was when the crash happened. Oil prices were very low at that point as well. I don't associate low oil prices with stock market crashes, by the way. I tend to think that low energy prices are on net a good thing for everybody. It's not great for me, but it's good for everybody else to have everything be cheaper. I think that when you adjust for inflation, the prices are even lower now than they were then. I mean, I remember, when I was in high school, paying less than $1 a gallon at the pump, and I mean, when that was long enough ago that inflation's a factor. So, uh, that's it. But I don't think the government they're not sending the rigs out to go and drill more wells to hurt the Chinese or to hurt the Saudis or hurt the Iranians or hurt the Russians. They seem to be the ones who are hurting the most from it. Probably because they have the biggest population that's kind of dependent on it, right? Saudi Arabia is not that many people, so now they're going to have silver-plated Escalades or whatever instead of gold-plated ones. With Russia, once you boil it down, the amount of wealth that each individual Russian gets out of the oil industry is, probably three hots in a cot, maybe not, a gold-plated SUV and, a yacht. But, and so when they go down, it's instead of three hots in a cot, it becomes two hots in a cot, and that's a bigger downgrade than they're looking at in Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Bahrain or UAE or any of those places. But still, it's significant to them. And I don't know, like I don't hear about a lot of fracking going on in those other places. My guess is that they have formations that could do it as well, and that they just don't have the expertise to go at it, or they just have enough of the regular stuff you don't need to frack that's just sitting around. Um, just in the years that I was doing it, the efficiency of the production increased enormously. The amount of time it took to drill a well decreased enormously. They were drilling these lateral sections where they would go sideways through the wells. And the first, couple of years that I worked, that could take 3 weeks. Just the lateral section could take 3 weeks. And they got better drill bits. They learned exactly like how much rotation it gets the fastest results, what kind of muds produce the best results. And next thing you know, the lateral sections were taking, instead of 3 weeks, they were taking 2 weeks, and then 10 days, and then 1 week, and then sometimes, 4 or 5 days, and, we were pumping out. I mean, the first couple wells that I worked, took, months. And now it's gotten to the point where like it's boom, 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 and it's the same. I mean, you think about it, it's the same well. It's going to produce the same amount of fuel, but if the amount of time it takes to drill it goes from 3 months to 1 month, it's a third cheaper. I mean, right? Because a big part of the cost, the biggest part of the cost, is the actual drilling operations. Is all the stuff that happens with the derrick there, all the people there that are required to drill that hole. Once the hole's made, they still do a lot of things. They have to frack it. That's not cheap, and maybe fracking may actually be more expensive. I'm not sure. It probably depends on the well. But once they're into the production phase, yeah, it just kind of sits there and shoots out oil all the time. I mean, or natural gas or whatever it is. So I definitely think that if you're looking for a big reason, a major contributor to the decrease, that's a big part of it. Now, again, that's not the only thing by any means. Whatever the economic downturn in China or in Japan, or the deal with Iran or anything else. Sure, fucking electric cars. I don't know, but like that's definitely a big thing, and that's definitely not an Alex Jonesian conspiracy of the government forcing the oil companies to do this. You know, the relationship between the oil industry and the government, just like all the other industries, is very complicated, but it's not one where the writ of Washington like animates them to do stuff. They're going after profits. It's totally, they know that there's natural gas there, or oil there. They know they can drill wells them, and they start doing it. I mean, that's that simple, and that adds up. You add 1,000 new wells to the stock, and you're just going to have more there, and like the demand is not going to go up at the same speed. Now this is not, by the way, I guess I should just mention peak oil. This does not affect peak oil in principle. All right, so like the argument against peak oil is not that, oh, we'll discover new oil fields. That would change our estimate of when peak oil would occur. So finding new oil, all this stuff with the Bakken and the Marcellus and the Eagleford, that would be, oh, okay, so peak oil isn't going to happen in 1964. It's going to happen in 1984 now because we discovered all this new oil. So that doesn't affect peak oil. Peak oil is affected by the fact that through innovation, the amount that we can yield from a given amount of a resource increases, right? So like it used to be with 1 kilogram of hydrocarbons, we could exact this amount of a certain amount of value. I mean, you could look at like a certain amount of energy, but it's actually more broad than a certain amount of value. With better technology, we can extract an even greater amount of value from that same amount. So like if we have, let's say 100 billion units of hydrocarbons total. Uh, you know, every year we can get more out of a given unit of those hydrocarbons. So there isn't, and what's the limit? The limit is if you have this finite amount, but then if you can multiply it by anything, then it's essentially an infinite amount. The other thing is through substitutions. You know, you used to use copper, for instance, to build, piping everywhere. And you could go and like, oh, we're going to eventually the price of copper will be cost the same as silver and blah blah blah. And then we invent PVC pipe, and all of a sudden the demand for copper in that area just collapses and the price of copper doesn't go up. And we see this in so many commodities that just aren't going up in price. And peak oil, people talk about peak oil, peak oil, peak oil. The argument is the same for everything, right? And there's a if you haven't heard it before, great economist Julian Simon wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource, basically all about this. Now his thesis, the ultimate resource are humans, that human beings and human ingenuity and technical innovation can multiply the resources that we have, and that there isn't any theoretical limit to that. Now, are there practical limits right now? Is there, can we get an infinite amount of value out of a gallon of oil? No, we can't. But we can get more than we could 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And he was famous for making a number of bets with the environmental alarmist Robert something Ehrlich. His last name is Ehrlich. He was a butterfly professor who kept saying, "Oh, he's writing books in like 1970 about like, well, by 1980 there'll be mass famine everywhere, and the population will crash because there'll be war, and then 1980 happens, and yeah, there's some famine in Ethiopia thanks to the socialist government, but there's no more famine than there was before. There's less. Um, he had a series of bets with Simon that the prices of certain commodities would decrease rather than increase, because the overpopulationists look at it like there's no way, everything has to get more expensive. There's six if we go from a population of 4 billion to 6 billion to 9 billion, the number of resources hasn't increased, and so there must be an increase in price. Um, well, aside from the fact that like the amount that we can extract has increased, even if the absolute number of mass of resources hasn't, um, the amount that we can yield out of a given resource continues to increase. And so the logic doesn't really work. And so, I mean, in a lot of ways, prices have come down. If you look in the long historical haul, incredibly. I mean, when you study like ancient history, for instance, it becomes very clear that things that we would consider not even valuable became much more of things like lead or iron. I mean, iron, people talk about like a sword being a really expensive thing, and like it's made out of iron. Like iron is like $1 a ton or some ridiculously small amount. Now I guess the sword, you put the labor into it and everything, but like something that like you can afford though as like a regular person, that you can have gold, that you can buy gold jewelry. You can be on welfare and buy gold jewelry. Like that's unheard of, like historically. That you could have. I mean, some of the early monies. Well, some of the first currencies weren't even metallic at all. They were things like barley and salt. And like, well, geez, how much barley would you need? Oh, I'm gonna go. You spend $80 at the grocery store. You need like, 5 carts full of barley to make that payment. It's just things have become, and what's crazy, because if we compare it to say the year AD 1 or whatever, the start of the Common Era, what was the population then? Like a billion people, or not even 100 million, something like that. Would have been like a billion, I think. Well, we got what, 6 times that, 7 times that now, and yet, I mean, I can go and fucking buy a 100-ounce bar of silver, any day of the week, or an ounce of gold or whatever, more if I had the money. And that was something that people historically couldn't do. Even though wait, it shouldn't be 6 times more expensive, right? Or 7 times more expensive? Shouldn't it be 7 times more rare now than it was for, my ancestors 40 generations removed? No, see, that's just, if that's the impulse, that's like the very simplistic way to look at it. It's a way that just doesn't take into account what humans actually do, how they actually behave, and how they actually innovate. And we've seen that. So like these new fields, obviously don't mean that we have an infinite supply of hydrocarbons in the earth. Certainly we don't. There's more than we thought. They're more extractable than we thought. That doesn't mean it's infinite. But and I don't want to make this a whole video about peak oil, but um, the amount of value, the amount of economic gain, amount of personal gain, amount of prosperity that we can yield out of a given amount, that goes up. And so to say there's a finite amount at base doesn't really mean all that much. So, and that's without even talking about asteroids or space exploration or any number of other things that could possibly radically alter this. So anyway, I just thought that would be interesting since some people had asked. But yeah, I definitely think that the fracking and the opening up of the new fields are a big factor in the decrease in the price in the short term. Long term, I don't know how much that's going to matter, but there it is. So anyway, I'll talk to you all later. Bye bye.